The ashes were still warm when Jake Peterson received the letter from the county lawyer. His uncle, Vernon Blackwood, had passed away at the age of 94, leaving behind a property that had been in the family for 3 generations. Jake hadn't seen Uncle Vernon in nearly 15 years, not since his grandmother's funeral back when Jake was just a boy of 19, fresh off the farm and eager to escape the mountains for the promise of city life. Now at 42, Jake stood before the charred remains of what had once been his uncle's cabin, watching smoke curl lazily from the ruins. The fire had happened 3 days ago, consuming most of the structure in a spectacular display that volunteers from the neighboring town had barely managed to contain to just the cabin itself. If it had spread to the forest, the whole mountainside could have gone up. Jake kicked at a piece of scorched timber with his boot, sending a small cloud of ash swirling into the mountain air. Behind him, the October wind whistled through the towering pines, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of burnt wood and old memories. This land was wild, remote, about as far from his apartment in Denver as a man could get and still be in the 21st century. The property was worthless now, Jake had figured. Any insurance money would barely cover the legal fees, and the land itself was too steep and inaccessible for development. The county had already sent him a notice that the cabin would need to be professionally cleared before anything else could be done. Between his job and his responsibilities, Jake had been planning to hire someone to haul away the debris and list the property with a land broker in the spring. But something made him pause. Vernon had been eccentric, certainly. The man had chosen to live alone in these mountains for 60-some years, with no electricity, no running water, and barely any contact with the outside world. He hunted, he fished, he grew what he could in the brief mountain summers. The locals said he was peculiar but harmless. They said he kept to himself, and he seemed content with that arrangement. Jake had been told the story many times, how Vernon had left his job as an engineer in California back in the 60s, disgusted with the rat race and the materialism of the modern world. He'd bought this land with money from an inheritance, something about his father dying in the war and leaving him a small sum, and he'd never looked back. For decades, he lived quietly, rarely coming down the mountain except for supplies he couldn't produce himself. As Jake stood surveying the wreckage, he remembered something his mother had mentioned once, years ago. Uncle Vernon is the smartest man you'll ever meet, but he chose to be nobody. You could spend your whole life and never really know what he was thinking. Jake's curiosity, dormant for years, suddenly stirred. The cabin had been a simple structure, one large room with a sleeping loft, a kitchen area, and a substantial stone fireplace that dominated one entire wall. The fireplace was the one thing that had survived the blaze relatively intact. Its stones had blackened but held firm, a testament to whatever mortar and technique had been used to construct it. As the afternoon light began to fade, Jake approached the fireplace ruins. It was massive, perhaps 7 feet across at its base, and climbing more than 15 feet up what remained of the cabin's frame. Vernon had built it himself, Jake somehow knew. The man had had an engineer's eye for structure and proportion. Jake reached up and ran his hand along the mortar lines. They were perfectly uniform, perfectly placed. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was the work of someone who had planned, calculated, and executed with precision. That's when Jake noticed something odd. Behind where the cabin's main room would have been, hidden by the thick stone mass of the fireplace, there seemed to be a hollow space. Jake could see it in the way the fireplace's back seemed to rest differently than its front, the way the weight seemed distributed unevenly. He'd been standing right in front of it for 20 minutes before the architectural inconsistency caught his eye. It might have been nothing. Old cabins had their quirks. But Vernon was an engineer, and engineers didn't make mistakes like uneven weight distribution by accident. Jake began carefully removing the charred remains of the cabin's roof that had partially collapsed onto the fireplace's rear side. The work was tedious and occasionally painful. His hands got cut on sharp metal and raw wood, but bit by bit, the back of the fireplace became more exposed. As the sun sank below the western peaks and the temperature dropped toward freezing, Jake felt it. A draft. A clear, unmistakable draft coming from behind the fireplace's massive stone structure. His heart quickened. With renewed energy, Jake worked faster, pulling away more debris. And then he saw it, a small opening, perhaps 2 feet square, hidden behind where the cabin's back wall would have been. It was clearly intentional. The stones had been carefully arranged to conceal it, and someone had sealed it further with newer mortar that the fire hadn't completely destroyed. Jake pulled out his phone and turned on its light, pointing it into the darkness of the opening. At first, he saw only blackness, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out the interior of what appeared to be a small chamber, carved right into the bedrock behind the fireplace. A hidden room. Uncle Vernon had built a secret room behind his fireplace. Jake sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Why would an old hermit need a hidden room? What would he possibly have to hide out here in the mountains, where the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away? The practical part of Jake's brain told him to stop, to call a professional, a contractor or an archaeologist or someone who knew what they were doing. The legal part of him wondered if he should inform the county, but the curious part of him, the part that had been dormant for 23 years, the part that had once dreamed of adventure before life had settled him into a comfortable but predictable routine, pushed him forward. Jake pulled out a flashlight from his truck, and with the dying light of day and the artificial light of his phone, he squeezed himself through the narrow opening and into Vernon's secret. The chamber was small, perhaps 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide, carved directly from the mountain's bedrock, with what must have been enormous effort and time. Vernon must have worked on this for years, Jake realized, chipping away at the rock with hand tools, inch by inch. The walls were smooth in some places, rough in others, but the overall structure was sound, perfectly sound, in fact. The angle of the ceiling suggested Vernon had understood load-bearing principles well enough to ensure the space wouldn't collapse. As Jake's eyes adjusted to the darkness and his flashlight beam cut through the shadows, he began to make out what was inside. Metal boxes, dozens of them. Steel ammunition boxes, military surplus storage containers, and custom-built metal crates filled the chamber from floor to nearly ceiling height. They were stacked with methodical precision, each one labeled with careful handwriting and what appeared to be dates. Jake's throat went dry. He pulled out the nearest box, and it was heavier than he expected. His arms strained as he maneuvered it toward the opening and then outside into the fading twilight. Once he had it out in the fresh air and daylight, he used a pry bar from his truck to carefully open it. Inside, stacked in neat rows, were bearer bonds, hundreds of them. Japanese bearer bonds, he saw, from the 1940s, each one printed on the finest paper, each one marked with astronomical numbers that seemed to swim before his eyes. His hands shook as he picked one up. 10 million yen, multiplied across 50 bonds in the first box alone, that was 500 million yen. At current exchange rates, that was somewhere in the range of... Jake couldn't do the math. His head was spinning. He opened a second box. More bonds, different denominations, different currencies. Swedish krona from the 1970s, Swiss francs from the 1950s, South African rand from various decades. There were also bearer stocks from defunct corporations, certificates of deposit in currencies that no longer existed, and what appeared to be personal checks and promissory notes from individuals Jake had never heard of, dated from the 1940s through the 1990s. It took Jake until nearly midnight to realize what he was looking at. It wasn't until he'd pulled out box after box, each one containing similar treasures, that the pattern became clear. These were assets, liquid, untraceable, anonymous assets. The kind of things that wealthy people accumulated during times of political turmoil and uncertainty. The kind of things that a man might collect if he wanted to keep his wealth hidden from governments, from taxes, from the eyes of the world. For 60 years, his uncle Vernon had been sitting on a mountain with what appeared to be a fortune in bearer bonds and anonymous financial instruments. Jake sat down hard on the ground, surrounded by open boxes and scattered papers, his flashlight held uselessly in his trembling fingers. He did the math in his head, roughly, trying to add up what he could see. The Japanese bonds alone might be worth $4 or $5 million at modern exchange rates. The Swiss francs could be another $3 or $4 million. The stocks and bonds in various other currencies, if they could be liquidated, might be worth another $2 or $3 million. He was looking at conservatively $15 to $20 million, and he hadn't opened more than 15% of the boxes. The thought that formed in his mind wasn't one of joy exactly. It was more of a kind of vertigo, a sensation of the world tilting beneath him. Jake Peterson, a mid-level project manager at an engineering firm in Denver, making $130,000 a year and struggling to pay his mortgage, was now the owner of what might be one of the largest private hoards of bearer bonds in the Western Hemisphere. He thought of his life, the apartment that was nice but not spectacular, the car that was paid off but 7 years old, the girlfriend he'd broken up with 2 years ago because he couldn't afford the kind of life she wanted. He thought of his mother, retired and living in Arizona on Social Security and a small pension. He thought of his sister, who'd had to put off having children because her and her husband couldn't make the numbers work in their Denver neighborhood anymore. None of them needed to worry about money ever again. Jake's hands continued to shake as he carefully repacked the boxes and began the process of moving them from the chamber to his truck. It took him hours, working by the light of his phone and a powerful flashlight from his vehicle. Some of the boxes were too heavy to move alone, but he managed to drag them slowly, one by one. By 3 a.m., he'd removed everything from the hidden chamber and stacked it all in his truck's bed, covered with a tarp. The chamber itself was now empty, its secret finally exposed after 60 years of careful concealment. As Jake locked his truck and climbed into the cab, exhausted beyond measure, he tried to think through the legal and practical implications of what he'd found. The money was his now. He was Vernon's only living heir. The will was clear. Everything Vernon owned became Jake's property. These bonds, these securities, this hidden fortune, it was all legally his to do with as he pleased. But there was a problem. A very serious problem. Bearer bonds, once the instrument of choice for anonymous wealth storage, had been increasingly restricted and monitored by governments around the world. Most countries had implemented regulations requiring the registration and verification of such instruments. Many of the bonds in his truck were now functionally worthless or severely restricted, but not all of them. Some of the Swiss francs, if they were legitimate, might still have value. The more recent bonds, those from the 1970s and 1980s, were more likely to be tradable, and there were other things in those boxes. Personal checks and promissory notes that, while unlikely to be cashed after 60 years, might still contain information about the source of Vernon's wealth. Information that Jake was going to need if he wanted to understand what he'd inherited and how to possibly liquidate it. Over the following weeks, Jake hired a private financial advisor, a man named Richard Chen, who specialized in alternative investments and unusual financial instruments. Richard was discreet, almost suspiciously so, and he seemed unsurprised by what Jake showed him. "Your uncle," Richard said carefully, looking through the documentation in Jake's private storage unit, "seems to have had significant resources, very significant, and he was cautious about holding them in conventional ways. Can any of this be converted to cash?" Jake asked directly. Richard took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Some of it, not all of it. The Japanese bonds are likely to be worthless. They were issued during wartime, and most were consolidated or replaced by new instruments in the post-war period. The Swiss francs might have some value to collectors, but as currency they're no longer in circulation. The stocks are defunct companies, mostly. Jake felt a sinking sensation. So it's all worthless? I didn't say that, Richard said carefully. There are collectors who pay premiums for rare bearer instruments. And there's something else. These promissory notes. Some of them are signed by individuals of considerable historical interest. This one here, signed in 1951, it's from a man who founded one of the largest industrial companies in Europe. If this is genuine, and if the terms can be verified, it might still have some value as a collectible. And what about the Swedish krona and the South African rand? Similar story, Richard said. Some value to collectors, but the real value here isn't in converting these to modern currency. The real value is in what they represent. Which is proof of assets, Richard said quietly. Your uncle held assets, significant assets, across multiple currencies and countries over several decades. That suggests he was connected to international financial networks, possibly wartime profiteering or black market activities. The question isn't whether these bonds are worth money today. The question is whether someone would want to buy this collection from you for what it represents. Jake understood then. His uncle had been more than just a hermit. Vernon had been something else entirely, a man who had been involved in something significant enough that he'd felt the need to hide his wealth for 6 decades. Over the next month, through Richard's careful cultivation of contacts, Jake was approached by 3 different collectors and one representative of what appeared to be a historical society based in Geneva. The collector who was most interested was a wealthy Japanese businessman named Takeshi Yamamoto, who specialized in acquiring financial instruments with historical significance. Yamamoto offered Jake $85 million for the entire collection. This, Yamamoto explained over a video call, his English accented but precise, is a time capsule of 20th century global finance. The bonds themselves, they are no longer worth their face value, but as a collection, as a record, they are extraordinary. I will display them in a private museum. They are not just money, they are history. Jake's first instinct was to accept, but something made him hesitate. Can you tell me anything about my uncle? Jake asked. Did he ever contact you? Did he ever try to sell these before? Yamamoto smiled. No. Your uncle, he kept these for himself, but I know about your uncle, actually. I know many people interested in Japanese bearer bonds from the war period. The community of collectors, we talk. And I know that your uncle was a man of principle. He took these bonds. Many Japanese would say he took them illegally, but he never used them, never tried to profit from them. He kept them hidden and lived simply. Why? Jake asked. Why would he do that? Because, Yamamoto said softly, he had a conscience. These bonds, they were connected to the Japanese war effort, connected to things that happened during the war that were not ethical. Your uncle took them to prevent them from being used for harm, I think. And then he spent his life as penance, living in the mountains like a monk. Jake's hands felt cold as Yamamoto spoke. He was a soldier, Jake asked slowly. During the war. Perhaps, Yamamoto said. Or perhaps something else. But I suspect he was involved in something he came to regret deeply. The bonds, they are his burden, and his redemption, both. After the call ended, Jake sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his inheritance suddenly feeling much heavier than it had before. Jake spent the next 3 months researching his uncle. He started with public records, birth certificates, employment records, military service documents. Vernon Peter Blackwood, born in 1921 in San Francisco. Parents, Richard Blackwood, deceased 1944, and Eleanor Smythe Blackwood, deceased 1952. Education, UC Berkeley, engineering degree, 1942. Military service, United States Army, 1942-1946. But there was a gap, a 4-year gap between graduation and enlistment. Officially, Vernon's records showed he was not enlisted until June of 1942, yet his degree was awarded in May of 1942. Either the records were wrong, or Vernon had spent his first year after graduation doing something else entirely. Jake hired a researcher, a former investigative journalist named Patricia Morrison, to dig deeper. He was with OSS, Patricia told him over coffee in Denver, spreading papers across the table. Office of Strategic Services, that's what became the CIA. Your uncle didn't have an official military record during his first year after college because he wasn't officially in the military. He was seconded to the OSS directly from UC Berkeley. They recruited bright engineering students directly out of university. Jake felt the pieces clicking into place. What did he do for the OSS? That's where it gets complicated, Patricia said. The OSS records from that period are heavily redacted, but based on what I could find through interviews with historians and cross-referencing with other documents, your uncle was involved in something called Operation Gold. It was a classified program that involved the confiscation and cataloging of Japanese financial assets in the Pacific Theater. That's a polite way of saying he stole them, Jake said. He stole them on behalf of the United States government, Patricia corrected, which is a completely different thing legally, if not morally. The OSS was authorized to seize enemy assets during wartime. The bearer bonds were part of the Japanese imperial government's emergency reserves, hidden in various locations throughout the Pacific. Your uncle's job was to find them and catalog them. And he kept some, Jake said. Patricia nodded slowly. It appears so. Only a small fraction of what was recovered, actually. Most of the bonds went back to be consolidated into the post-war Japanese currency system. But your uncle seems to have hidden away several boxes before the official records were finalized. As to why, that's the question. The researcher, Jake said, Yamamoto. He said my uncle felt guilty. That would make sense, Patricia said. After the war, there were a lot of men who were involved in questionable activities, all officially sanctioned, all necessary for the war effort, but questionable nonetheless. Some of them had a hard time living with it. Your uncle seems to have been one of them. But why keep the bonds? Jake pressed. Why not just destroy them or donate them? Because, Patricia said carefully, I think your uncle understood something that most people didn't. Those bonds represented real wealth, real power. If they were destroyed or officially returned, that wealth would be absorbed back into the Japanese imperial system. But if they were kept hidden, kept out of circulation, then they couldn't be used to fund anything harmful. And your uncle's presence in the mountains, his silence, his refusal to use the wealth, that was his way of keeping that power neutralized. Jake understood then. His uncle hadn't been running away from the world because he wanted to escape it. He'd been running away because he needed to isolate himself from the temptation that the wealth represented. 60 years of solitude was his self-imposed penance for a sin that hadn't been entirely his to commit. There's one more thing, Patricia said, sliding another folder across the table. I found this in archived OSS correspondence from 1948. A memo from a superior officer recommending that your uncle receive a commendation for his work. But the commendation was never officially awarded. My guess is that sometime around 1948, your uncle either confessed to missing bonds or was suspected of confiscating them. The OSS, by that time in transition to the CIA, didn't want any more scandal. So they quietly let him go. No charges, no investigation, no commendation, just separation from service. Jake felt a sudden compassion for his uncle. A young man, brilliant and idealistic, caught up in the machinery of war and international finance, faced with the reality of what his government was doing and asked to participate in it. And in the end, he tried to neutralize the weapon by removing himself from the world entirely. What do I do? Jake asked Patricia. Morally, I mean, not legally. Legally, the money is mine, but morally. Patricia considered the question carefully. "I think your uncle already answered that for you. He spent 60 years keeping that wealth from doing harm. The question is, what harm does it do good?" Over the next month, Jake made a decision. He accepted Takeshi Yamamoto's offer of $85 million for the bearer bonds collection on one condition: that Yamamoto establish a foundation to preserve the history of what the bonds represented. An educational foundation that would document the history of wartime financial extraction, the experiences of soldiers and OSS operatives like Vernon who'd been complicit in it, and the ethical complexities of modern warfare and economic conflict. Yamamoto agreed immediately, suggesting that he'd been hoping for exactly such a condition. Jake's portion of the sale, after taxes and fees, came to roughly $68 million. With that money, Jake resigned from his job in Denver. He took $10 million and gave it to his mother, setting her up in a beautiful home in Arizona with an annuity that would support her for the rest of her life. He gave his sister $8 million, enough to raise her family comfortably and provide for their education. The remaining $50 million, Jake decided, would become his uncle's legacy. He established the Vernon Blackwood Foundation, dedicated to supporting communities in mountainous regions that had been isolated from economic opportunity. The foundation funded schools, medical clinics, and infrastructure projects in rural areas of Appalachia, the Rockies, and internationally in the Andes and the Himalayas. Jake's explanation for the sudden wealth was simple: an inheritance from a distant relative, combined with some very successful investments. People accepted it mostly. A few friends were skeptical, but no one pushed the issue. People who suddenly became very wealthy often had good reasons to be vague about how it happened. But privately, Jake knew the truth. And in the summer following his inheritance, Jake left Denver. He moved to a small town in the mountains of Colorado, not far from where his uncle's cabin had stood. He built a new cabin on the same land, hiring contractors this time rather than doing it himself, but designing it with the same simple elegance and structural integrity that Vernon had brought to his work. He spent his days reading history, philosophy, literature, subjects he'd always meant to explore but never had time for. He spent his evenings looking out at the mountains, thinking about his uncle and the life that Vernon had chosen. In the spring of his second year on the mountain, Jake met a woman named Sarah at the town's library. She was a teacher, recently relocated to the area, and she shared his love of reading and his desire to understand the complexity of human choice and consequence. They fell in love gradually, over shared books and long conversations and hikes through the summer mountains. When Jake finally told Sarah about his uncle's inheritance and his past, she didn't react with shock or judgment. Instead, she took his hand and said, "He sounds like he was a good man who was faced with impossible choices. I think what you're doing with his legacy is exactly what he would have wanted." Jake and Sarah were married the following autumn, as the aspen trees turned gold and the mountain air grew crisp. The wedding was small, only close friends and family, held at the cabin. Jake's mother came, now healthy and happy in her retirement. His sister came with her family, including the 2 children that she'd been able to have because of Jake's generosity. Takeshi Yamamoto came, flying in from Japan to celebrate with his friend. Even Patricia Morrison came, the researcher who'd helped unlock the mystery of Vernon's past. As they all stood together at sunset, looking out over the mountains, Jake felt a sense of peace that he'd never experienced in his old life in Denver. The money that had seemed so overwhelming, so transformative, had been integrated into something larger than itself, a legacy of redemption and renewal. Vernon Blackwood's hidden fireplace had contained more than just bearer bonds and financial instruments. It had contained the material evidence of a man's struggle with conscience and consequence, and in that struggle, preserved for 60 years in the darkness, it had also contained the seed of something better. In the years that followed, the Vernon Blackwood Foundation grew into one of the most respected charitable organizations in the United States. Rural clinics it had funded saved lives. Schools it had built educated thousands of children who would otherwise have had no access to quality education. Communities that had been dying were revitalized, not through dependency on outside money, but through the infrastructure and opportunity that proper investment provided. And every year, on the anniversary of the discovery, Jake would hike up to the place where Vernon's cabin had been. He would sit by the ruins of the great fireplace and think about his uncle, the soldier and engineer, the man who had learned early that sometimes the most important work is not in building wealth, but in preventing it from doing harm. The mountains around him would stand eternal, just as they had stood witness to Vernon's 60 years of solitude and penance. And Jake would be at peace, knowing that his uncle's burden had been transformed into blessing, his secret into salvation. 5 years after establishing the Vernon Blackwood Foundation, Jake received an unexpected visitor at his cabin. It was a Thursday in late October, nearly a decade after he'd first discovered his uncle's secret, when an elderly Japanese man arrived at his door. The man introduced himself as Kenji Sato, and his English was impeccable, spoken with the precision of someone who had spent decades studying the language. He was perhaps 85 years old, with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of history. "Mr. Peterson," Kenji said, accepting the cup of tea that Jake offered him, "I have come to tell you the rest of your uncle's story, the part that is not in the official records." Jake's hands went still. He had thought he knew the entire story by now. "How do you know my uncle?" "I was a soldier," Kenji said simply. "Japanese army in the Pacific. I was 16 years old when the war ended. My father was a high-ranking officer in the Imperial Finance Ministry. He was involved in moving assets, hiding them from the Americans, hiding them from his own government, depending on the situation. Your uncle was the one who found us." Jake listened intently as Kenji recounted a story that had never appeared in any of the official records that Patricia Morrison had uncovered. In 1945, as American forces closed in on the Japanese mainland, there was chaos and confusion in the finance ministry. Kenji's father, Colonel Toshiro Sato, along with several other officers, had become convinced that Japan was going to lose the war. They began a secret operation to preserve certain assets, not for the government's use, but for the eventual rebuilding of Japan after defeat. "My father believed," Kenji explained, "that Japan would need resources to recover, resources that the Americans would not allow if they knew about them. So he worked with others to hide bearer bonds, precious metals, and other assets in locations throughout the Pacific. It was technically treason, you understand. If the war had gone differently, if Japan had won, my father would have been executed for his actions." Vernon, working as an OSS operative specializing in financial assets, had been tracking these hidden caches. But instead of simply confiscating them all, Vernon had encountered Kenji's father in person during one of his investigations. "Your uncle," Kenji said, "was a man of honor. My father knew this immediately. Your uncle realized that my father was not trying to enrich himself, but trying to save his nation. And your uncle made a choice that cost him dearly." Vernon had reported only a fraction of the assets he found to his superiors. He deliberately left certain caches undiscovered, deliberately failed to mention certain locations. And he had made a private arrangement with Kenji's father. In exchange for Vernon's silence, Kenji's family would preserve their own honor and their father's intentions. They would use the hidden assets carefully and slowly over the following decades to rebuild not their family fortune, but their nation's trust. "My father lived until 1968, Kenji continued. In that time, he quietly worked to support educational initiatives in Japan, to fund cultural preservation, to help regions devastated by the war to recover. He did this using the assets that your uncle chose not to report. When he died, he passed the responsibility to me." Jake began to understand. "The bonds my uncle kept were a guarantee," Kenji finished. "My father and your uncle made an informal agreement. If my father ever violated the trust, if he ever used the assets for personal gain, or for any purpose that violated the spirit of rebuilding Japan, your uncle would come forward with evidence. The bonds your uncle kept were evidence. They were his insurance policy that my father's noble intentions would be maintained." "Did my uncle ever contact your father?" "After the war?" "Once," Kenji said. "Only once, in 1951. Your uncle came to Japan. It was a brief visit, but he met with my father. According to my father's journal, which I have read many times, your uncle told him that he was going to leave civilization. He said the weight of knowing about these hidden assets, the moral burden of having chosen to look away from some of the war's plunder, was too much to bear while living in the world. He said he needed to live in solitude to process what he had done." Kenji paused, sipping his tea carefully. "My father wrote in his journal that your uncle was the most honorable man he had ever met. Because your uncle did not simply take the moral high ground, he took the burden. He took the guilt, the complicity, and he bore it himself. He became a hermit not to escape justice, but to make sure that justice would be tempered with mercy." "I don't understand," Jake said, though part of him did. "My uncle was just one man, one OSS operative. He couldn't have changed the course of what happened." "No," Kenji agreed, "but he changed the course of one man's life, my father's life, and through my father, he changed the course of Japan's recovery. Your uncle's silence, his choice to look away from certain assets, allowed Japan to rebuild with dignity rather than with the humiliation of complete economic subjugation. And it allowed my father to live the last 20 years of his life knowing that at least some good had come from his wartime actions." Kenji reached into his bag and withdrew a leather journal, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "I have brought my father's journal to you. Your uncle deserves to have it. I kept it as long as I could to honor my father's wishes. But I am old now, and I have no children. My father's line will end with me. It is time that someone else understood the full complexity of what your uncle chose to do." Jake accepted the journal with trembling hands. On the first page, in careful handwriting, were words in Japanese. Kenji translated, "The measure of a man is not what he takes, but what he chooses not to take, and why." Over the following weeks, Jake worked with a translator to read through his uncle's father's entire journal. The entries spanned from 1945 to 1968, and they painted a picture that was far more complex than the official history suggested. 5 years after establishing the Vernon Blackwood Foundation, Jake received an unexpected visitor at his cabin. It was a Thursday in late October, nearly a decade after he'd first discovered his uncle's secret, when an elderly Japanese man arrived at his door. The man introduced himself as Kenji Sato, and his English was impeccable, spoken with the precision of someone who had spent decades studying the language. He was perhaps 85 years old, with silver hair and eyes that held the weight of history. "Mr. Peterson," Kenji said, accepting the cup of tea that Jake offered him, "I have come to tell you the rest of your uncle's story, the part that is not in the official records." Jake's hands went still. He had thought he knew the entire story by now. "How do you know my uncle?" "I was a soldier," Kenji said simply. "Japanese army in the Pacific. I was 16 years old when the war ended. My father was a high-ranking officer in the Imperial Finance Ministry. He was involved in moving assets, hiding them from the Americans, hiding them from his own government depending on the situation. Your uncle was the one who found us." Jake listened intently as Kenji recounted a story that had never appeared in any of the official records that Patricia Morrison had uncovered. In 1945, as American forces closed in on the Japanese mainland, there was chaos and confusion in the finance ministry. Kenji's father, Colonel Toshiro Sato, along with several other officers, had become convinced that Japan was going to lose the war. They began a secret operation to preserve certain assets, not for the government's use, but for the eventual rebuilding of Japan after defeat. My father believed, Kenji explained, that Japan would need resources to recover, resources that the Americans would not allow if they knew about them. So he worked with others to hide bearer bonds, precious metals, and other assets in locations throughout the Pacific. It was technically treason, you understand. If the war had gone differently, if Japan had won, my father would have been executed for his actions. Vernon, working as an OSS operative specializing in financial assets, had been tracking these hidden caches. But instead of simply confiscating them all, Vernon had encountered Kenji's father in person during one of his investigations. "Your uncle," Kenji said, "was a man of honor. My father knew this immediately. Your uncle realized that my father was not trying to enrich himself, but trying to save his nation. And your uncle made a choice that cost him dearly." Vernon had reported only a fraction of the assets he found to his superiors. He deliberately left certain caches undiscovered, deliberately failed to mention certain locations, and he had made a private arrangement with Kenji's father. In exchange for Vernon's silence, Kenji's family would preserve their own honor and their father's intentions. They would use the hidden assets, carefully and slowly, over the following decades, to rebuild not their family fortune, but their nation's trust. My father lived until 1968, Kenji continued. In that time, he quietly worked to support educational initiatives in Japan, to fund cultural preservation, to help regions devastated by the war to recover. He did this using the assets that your uncle chose not to report. When he died, he passed the responsibility to me. Jake began to understand. The bonds my uncle kept were a guarantee, Kenji finished. My father and your uncle made an informal agreement. If my father ever violated the trust, if he ever used the assets for personal gain or for any purpose that violated the spirit of rebuilding Japan, your uncle would come forward with evidence. The bonds your uncle kept were evidence. They were his insurance policy that my father's noble intentions would be maintained. Did my uncle ever contact your father after the war? Once, Kenji said. Only once in 1951. Your uncle came to Japan. It was a brief visit, but he met with my father. According to my father's journal, which I have read many times, your uncle told him that he was going to leave civilization. He said the weight of knowing about these hidden assets, the moral burden of having chosen to look away from some of the war's plunder, was too much to bear while living in the world. He said he needed to live in solitude to process what he had done. Kenji paused, sipping his tea carefully. My father wrote in his journal that your uncle was the most honorable man he had ever met. Because your uncle did not simply take the moral high ground. He took the burden. He took the guilt, the complicity, and he bore it himself. He became a hermit not to escape justice, but to make sure that justice would be tempered with mercy. I don't understand, Jake said, though part of him did. My uncle was just one man, one OSS operative. He couldn't have changed the course of what happened. No, Kenji agreed, but he changed the course of one man's life. My father's life, and through my father, he changed the course of Japan's recovery. Your uncle's silence, his choice to look away from certain assets, allowed Japan to rebuild with dignity rather than with the humiliation of complete economic subjugation. And it allowed my father to live the last 20 years of his life, knowing that at least some good had come from his wartime actions. Genji reached into his bag and withdrew a leather journal, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. I have brought my father's journal to you. Your uncle deserves to have it. I kept it as long as I could, to honor my father's wishes. But I am old now, and I have no children. My father's line will end with me, It is time that someone else understood the full complexity of what your uncle chose to do. Jake accepted the journal with trembling hands. On the first page, in careful handwriting, were words in Japanese. Kenji translated, "The measure of a man is not what he takes, but what he chooses not to take, and why." Over the following weeks, Jake worked with a translator to read through his uncle's father's entire journal. The entries spanned from 1945 to 1968, and they painted a picture that was far more complex than the official history suggested. Colonel Toshiro Sato had indeed used the hidden assets to help rebuild Japan. But more importantly, he had used them to create a network of educators, scientists, and cultural leaders who would shape Japan's post-war identity. He had funded the early research that would eventually lead to Japan's advances in electronics and manufacturing. He had supported poets and artists and philosophers who would help Japan recover its sense of self after the devastating loss of war. And crucially, according to entries in the journal, Sato had been very careful never to use the assets for personal enrichment. When he died, he left his family no great inheritance. Instead, he left them a legacy of having helped their nation rebuild. Vernon, according to the journal, had checked in once more with Sato in 1962, sending a letter inquiring whether Sato had maintained the trust that Vernon had placed in him. Sato's response, quoted in the journal, was simple. "Yes, honor is maintained, all is well." That was the last contact they ever had. After reading the journal, Jake sat alone in his cabin for 3 days, barely eating or sleeping. He had come to terms with his uncle's role in taking the bearer bonds, but learning that Vernon had deliberately chosen to help a Japanese officer preserve assets that would help Japan rebuild, that was a different moral territory entirely. His uncle had essentially committed treason, in a sense. He had betrayed his government's interests to serve a larger moral purpose. He had chosen to believe that Japan deserved to rebuild with dignity, even if that went against his nation's interests. Jake called Kenji and invited him back to the cabin. "I need to know something," Jake said when Kenji arrived. "Did my uncle ever regret this? Did he ever express doubt about his choice to help your father?" Kenji smiled sadly. "My father asked him this very question in the only letter they exchanged after that 1951 meeting. Your uncle's response was brief, but I think it tells you what you need to know. He wrote, 'I regret many things, but helping to give a man the chance to do good is not one of them.'" Jake understood then why his uncle had spent 60 years in isolation. It wasn't because he regretted what he'd done. It was because he had been forced to live with the knowledge that his government, the government he had served with honor, would have considered him a traitor if they had known. The isolation was his way of honoring the secrecy that his actions demanded. With Kenji's permission, Jake added Colonel Toshiro Sato's journal to the Vernon Blackwood Foundation's archives. The journal became one of the centerpieces of the Foundation's educational mission, a document that showed how individual moral choices, made in the midst of war and chaos, could ripple across decades and continents. The Foundation expanded its mission to include Japanese-American reconciliation and the study of how nations rebuild after devastating conflicts. Jake invited historians from both countries to work together to examine the complexities of post-war reconstruction. When Kenji returned to Japan after his visit, he brought with him one more gift. It was a photograph taken in 1951 showing 2 young men standing together in a garden in Kyoto. One was clearly a younger version of Colonel Toshiro Sato. The other, unmistakably, was Jake's Uncle Vernon. They stood side by side, neither smiling exactly, but both seeming to project a quiet sense of understanding. Between them, in the background, was a stone wall covered with ivy, and beyond it, a mountain peak visible in the distance. Jake had the photograph framed and hung it in the Foundation's main office, next to portraits of both men with their names and dates. Beneath the photograph, he had a plaque installed with a single inscription: 2 men, two nations, one choice, honor. That autumn, Jake received an invitation to travel to Japan for the dedication of a new educational center in Kyoto. A center built with funding from the Vernon Blackwood Foundation and dedicated to the study of post-war reconciliation and reconstruction. Sarah and Jake traveled together, and standing in the newly built center, surrounded by historians and educators from both countries, Jake felt his uncle's presence profoundly. Vernon had never seen this. Vernon had never known that his secret choice would eventually bear such fruit. But somehow, Jake thought, his uncle probably would have known. Vernon had spent his life in the mountains, removed from the world, but not ignorant of it. He had trusted that the universe held some measure of justice, some capacity for redemption. As Jake cut the ribbon to open the center, he thought of his uncle sitting alone in his cabin, day after day, year after year, carrying the weight of secrets that he could never share, choices that he could never explain, and he realized that Vernon's real legacy wasn't the money at all. It was the faith that one man's choice to do what is right, even when it meant betraying his own government, even when it meant living in exile, could eventually transform the world into something better. Vernon had been alone on the mountain, but he had never been truly isolated. His actions, known only to a handful of people, had echoed across the decades, creating ripples of good that would continue long after his death. As Jake returned home to Colorado, he added a new entry to the Foundation's mission statement, in memory of Vernon Blackwood and Colonel Toshiro Sato. Two men who understood that the work of peace and reconciliation sometimes requires us to act in silence, to carry burdens alone, and to trust that justice will eventually find its way. The mountains stood eternal, keeping their secrets, nurturing the good seeds that had been planted, and Jake Peterson, heir to a mystery and a fortune, spent the rest of his life ensuring that his uncle's impossible choice would bear fruit for generations to come.